Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Love, Death, and Robots Volume 1. Yeah, I really did thoroughly enjoy this show. I have reviewed this once before, but I don't think I'm going to go into, or I don't think I went into much detail with the first time around. I think this time around I will have a little bit more detail to every episode. I think really the first time around I just kind of really just try to like ram through a lot of it because reasonably I'm like going into this episode, we end up having reasonably me talking probably about any number of these episodes, probably out of order, because it looks like the Google episodes of these are not exactly in the order of the show. But I will be talking about every episode. I will be diving in quickly through a lot of them because there is a lot to go through. 18 episodes, but all of them are like 10 minutes, so it should be like hopefully a very brief thing about all of them. The one thing that I do like about this is you get a wide variety of visuals going on into this show. You get any number of kind of points in time where you end up seeing some provocative like imagery, and also you end up seeing quite a bit of times where you end up seeing some interesting action sequences and stuff along the episodes. We end up, I think, probably my favorite episode is probably got to be either the Suits episode or probably has to probably be the Shapeshifters episode, or really it probably has to be the Blind Spot episode. Those are the ones that I kind of really do enjoy. I think the alternate history thing is a really kind of fun episode where you end up seeing how many numerous times over and over again what would happen if Adolf ended up getting killed numerous different ways and how that would affect our future if that were to have happened. I think the Secret War episode is also really cool. You end up having a bunch of Russian Esh-like characters who end up realizing that a a a thing is attacking their lands, and they have to go and try and take this thing down. And I'll talk more about that in spoilers. Yeah, so if people are seeing these episodes and I'm talking about them out of order, I do apologize, but otherwise, check them out once I do get to them. Uh, Really, I just want to try to quickly, as much as possible. This Love, Death, and Robots seemingly has to bizarrely do a lot with cats. Every single episode has some kind of cat theme with it, for the most point, or it seems that there is also kind of consistent themes throughout here, where it seems like there's always like somebody turning into a wolf, or there seems to be some alien invasion going on, or some kind of monster demonic invasion of sorts, or there is one episode where we end up having a different variation of uh, Dracula, bizarrely, that looks more like a monster. We end up having a lot of space episodes within these 18 episodes. We end up having a lot to do with space. It's either somebody ends up getting off course, and so we end up finding out how far off course that they are, or they end up being in space, making some accidental mistake that ends up having them to desperately try to figure out how to make it back to where they were at originally before this whole accident of theirs happened. We end up having reasonably the we end up having some very goofy episodes, some really fun episodes, like Yogurt basically trying to take over the world. We end up having uh, Hitler being killed a million times over, and the effect of that. We end up having a guy who is to otherwise tell us a story about a junkyard that ended up biting back, let's just say, and really we end up having a shapeshifter story about uh, a military that hires seemingly werewolf-like characters. Seemingly. But yeah, really fun, interesting episodes. I really enjoy them. Uh, but yeah, plus also there's one episode where we end up having a person's freezer that creates some utopia within it. It's really interesting. Go ahead and check it out if you haven't already. I'm only reviewing this basically because I had heard that there's going to quite possibly be a second volume or a second installment of Love, Death, and Robots. So I wanted to go and try to watch this recently, so that way I could be able to then get into the next season without there being any problems of me like, oh yeah, like I watched the first season, but I haven't reviewed it yet, technically on this channel. But yeah, it is covered. Believe me, it is. So I think it's about that time to go into spoilers because I've already went over my 5 minutes. Trust me, this is a very good show. It's a very interesting show. Recently, it's also TVMA, so it may not be suitable for everyone. Really, there might be some episodes that people may like and people may not like. Really, I just go in through here and watch the entire show. Even though this is a variety show, I just go ahead and watch like through the whole thing. Like to me, like I always go through a show and try to watch the entire thing, especially if it's even a variety like thing. I know some people might skip episodes and whatever, but no, I like to watch every little episode, even though I know full well that I'm not going to like blah 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 episode. Um, but yeah, so let's get into that double five because otherwise it's about that time to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time to get to spoil who this show. So recently, I'm not going to have every single name of every single character that ends up and winds up on the show, but there might be some names that I get in here and there, just because luckily I did some research after this. Because I'm like, I don't know these people's names. I gotta figure this out. And so, luckily, I was able to do that. So, with that said, let's talk about the first episode, Sonia's Edge. So, we end up having a character named Sonia who seems to have scars over her face. It seems that she is to be in a death match with a guy named Simon. The only thing of this is that this is not a death match between two people. This is a death match between two monsters. It seems that Sunny, or I think I said Sonia. Sunny. I'll pause here for a second. All right, so Sunny has a cobra symbol upon her chest, and we end up having also another fighter who is Simon, who he has kind of symbols all over his chest. So we end up having it to where Sunny is to go on and present her monster named Carnivore. And it seems that this monster seemingly has these kind of tentacles, or these tentacles with kind of jabbing like knives upon them that end up striking onto this monster. It seems like there is very much back and forth where we end up having Sonny, who is to supposedly take a dive. We end up having a guy, I think his name is Dickie or Dick or something along those lines. Uh, Dick and Jennifer, I think, are to tell Sonny before this match even starts that she needs to take a dive, and Sonny doesn't take dives. So we have this back and forth matchup. It seems that eventually Simon with his monster is to eventually get a upper hand, and these characters are linked with their monsters, so that's how evidently they know how to exactly fight. And so we end up having Sonny telling uh, this fight promoter guy that she has an edge more so than anybody else does, and we'll eventually figure out within the end of this episode what this episode or what that uh, twist is. So we have it to where eventually that Simon is to get the upper hand or Simon's monster is to get the upper hand on the carnivore and eventually go and stab into it. But eventually, we end up having Sonny's character eventually win this fight by basically going and taking her head and running it through this character, this other monster. And so we end up having it to where eventually Sonny's carnivore ends up winning this matchup, and so like it's very interesting, this huge whole fight out and so on and so forth. And so we end up having it to where Sunny is kind of cherishing her winnings with her coworkers, and so we end up having Sunny who ends up bumping back into Jennifer, and it seems that Sunny and Jennifer are going to seemingly being seduced within one another. And so we end up finding out that seemingly Jennifer has some ability where she ends up taking these knives to otherwise put through the head of this Sonny. To where we're like, oh no, the hero lost in the end. Oh, isn't that too bad? And so we end up having the fight promoter coming into seeing that Sonny is now dead. We end up having Jennifer crushing Sonny's head, and we end up finding out that it seems that all along that we end up finding out that Sonny was just a shell of a person. That the real actual Sonny, the real actual personality and everything, was in the carnivore all along. Hence why you saw Sonny just in like this yoga pose, this calm, and like she never really moved because she wasn't actually a real boy. She was just a puppet for the actual thing, which was carnivore. So yeah, we end up having the carnivore appear and going and killing both Jennifer and the fight promoter, and that is how the first episode ends. So the next episode, we end up having three robots going out and examining the remains of this thing called planet Earth. We end up having these three robots. I think one of them is called Xbot, the guy who ends up the robot that ends up putting an eye within his eye. Uh, I guess he's Xbot 4000. We end up also having a smaller robot that I think is called like NC something, NCR or something. And we end up having also this kind of weirdly looking triangle-ish looking robot. Uh, so we end up having these three robots kind of uh, going through the planet Earth and seeing the remains and trying to understand what humans used to do within this world. And so we end up having it to where it seems like these three robots end up finding this thing called a basketball. And so the NC whichever the smaller robot, ends up telling Xbox 4000 or Xbot to go and pick up the basketball and try to bounce it because I guess that's what humans used to do for fun. So we end up having the Xbot just lightly dropping the basketball and it bounces and then it stops. And they're like, well, hey man, like that looked cool, but like, what did you feel? And he was like, yeah, it's a little anticlimactic. We end up eventually having these robots consistently going to a diner to understand digestion and how food used to work for humans. And then eventually they end up going into one home to sit down, to where eventually they end up having a cat appear in front of them. they don't know what the heck this is. They don't understand what it is. And so they end up having it to where uh, this smaller robot tells Xbot that he should probably try and like pet the thing to see if it'll go away, that it'll get annoyed. But instead, we end up having this Xbot going and petting it, and the cat ends up just kind of purring to where the Xbot notices this and tells the other robots, and they're like, "Oh my God, the cat's going to explode." The cat doesn't explode. It's not an exploding cat. But then eventually, we end up having seemingly this cat follow these robots around. Like he latches himself onto them. Eventually, the Xbot ends up going and taking uh, the cat and putting it on the smaller robot's head, and so on and so forth. We end up having eventually the Xbot seeing its like great grandfather that I guess was a gaming system, and so on and so forth. And then eventually they end up going and seeing a nuclear bomb, which I guess was also a ancestor to them because they are, I guess, nuclear like robots. And we end up finally having it to where we find out within the story that evidently the cats within the story can talk and say, yeah, like we eventually just ended up just like outliving all the humans, and like yeah, we definitely like took them over, and this is the cat talking. And so we end up having all these cats just starting to surround all these robots, and we are to naturally assume that probably all the robots were probably killed off by bizarrely all these cats. Doesn't make sense, but it is what it is. So we are to move on to this episode called The Witness. So don't know any of the names of these characters that were in this episode, but I can at least explain it. And I think all of their names are like super generic, anyways. They're probably like the woman and the man and the host and the this and the that. So we end up having seeing that a man had killed a woman, and he had done this right by a window that had been seemingly for anyone to see at it. We end up finding out that there is a man who ended up killing a woman, and so we end up having this man looking outside this window to notice that exact same woman that he had just killed had saw what he had done and had started to run off. And this man ended up chasing this woman down so that way he can try to either kill her or get at her. So we end up finding this woman who ends up kind of being chased all through town. Eventually, she ends up getting a car. We end up finding this man even like following her via another car. We end up having this woman going all the way to get to her performance job. Evidently, she's a dancer of sorts, which evidently that means she kind of takes off her clothes for money. She ends up going to some host guy that is very goofy looking. It's very all like metal and spikes and whatever all up in his entire body. We end up having eventually that this woman is to eventually go and do this performance, and eventually she is to do this camera like performance where this man is also in this environment as well, and eventually she ends up seeing him through a camera lens of sorts, and so she ends up quitting doing her dancing or her camming or her whatever, and she ends up running off to where the man goes and tries to run off after her. We end up having this woman going all the way to this seemingly apartment of sorts where she ends up trying to find the nearest uh, door that is unlocked, and eventually she ends up finding that. And so we end up having this man who, I guess luckily this was actually his apartment room. He ends up unlocking the door, coming on in, and then they end up having a fight out. They end up having to attack one another, and eventually we end up having this woman who ends up getting the upper hand and ending up killing this man. And when this woman ends up looking out of the window of which that uh, she had just killed this man from, she ends up seeing the exact same looking man outside this window, and then the chase goes on and on. So, like, I'm naturally assuming that probably we end up having it to where there's going to be like a billion different variations of these people that they end up killing one another, and this is just a consistent chase where I guess it's never going to end is what I'm assessing and or assuming. So moving on, we end up having a character called Hank, and this is the only character that I know from this episode. We end up having a character called Hank, and it seems that there are two other associates, farmers uh, that this guy works with. I would say works because that's kind of like a loose kind of way of thinking. So we end up having Hank, who is this farmer that seems that uh, he ends up doing a little bit more than actually farming. We end up having this Hank who ends up having this wife who is to go and like be on all these computers and doing all these assessing, and so we end up having Hank who ends up putting himself into some giant like mech suit who we are assessing like, okay, maybe this is like a technical way of doing farming, maybe this is like the future of farming. But instead, we end up finding out that within this farm, there seems to be some universe hole in this planet that they are in. That it seems that there seems to be aliens coming out of uh, this hole, this universe hole, and so we end up finding these monsters that end up coming out of this hole to where we end up having Hank and his big mech machine going and shooting out a bunch of these monsters and or aliens. So we end up seemingly having it to where Hank seems to have shot out and killed all the monsters that ended up coming out of this dimensional hole, but we end up having Hank, who has only one cow left to his name. We end up finding Hank, who ends up realizing that there is a bigger breach going on. Then he realizes that there is a lot more aliens coming through or monsters coming through these dimensional holes. And so we end up having Hank, who's like, dude, we need to call everybody. Like, we need to call everyone. And so we have it to where Hank's wife ends up calling up two other people. I think one character's name might have been Meg or Mel or something along those lines. And there seems to be another guy that needs to try to do some work on his mech. But so we end up having it to where eventually these three mechs all go out there and like I say mechs because like I don't know the right terminology. These giant Iron Man like characters, like that's like basically like imagine like Ironmonger kind of size. If you guys remember the very first Iron Man movie, the villain of that movie, that kind of size. So we end up having these people going out in these giant robots to eventually fend off all of these aliens, and we end up having it to where eventually the onslaught just keeps going and going and going to where we end up having one of Hank's farmers decide, well, hey man, like I'm just going to detonate and try to wipe these things out. I'm going to go and uh, like give myself up as a bomb to take these things down. And we end up having Hank who's like, no, don't do it. But eventually he ends up doing it, and so he ends up killing off all of these aliens or monsters or whatever they are. And we end up having eventually that Hank has to go and console this guy's or this guy's wife and to just say like, well, hey, like he did the best he could kind of thing. And so we end up finding out that this planet that these people are on aren't or isn't actually a Earth. Like it's some kind of like Saturn goofy looking planet that isn't actually Earth. Hence why there's kind of a slight variation of why all of a sudden there's monsters that all of a sudden arrive on this planet out of these like portal like things. It's very weird. It's really cool. But anyways, moving on. So we end up having Sucker of Souls. So this is a Dracula like story. We end up having seemingly one scientific or he's kind of more of a like a knowledge guy, like one of those kind of knowledge guys that read too many books when he was a kid. So we have knowledge guy who is with three mercenaries, and so we end up having it to where these this mercenary and this knowledge guy seemingly ending up in these caves where they end up bumping into this thing called Dracula or the Impaler. And so we end up having it to where reasonably this mercenary is trying to take out this Dracula. He's trying to like shoot it and it does nothing. He uses a knife and it does nothing. We end up having Dracula mentioning in his language that, hey, cool, you're a warrior. I'm gonna consume you. I'm gonna consume your heart. And so we luckily end up having it to where it seems that a cat just randomly appears out of the fray, and we end up having this mercenary grabbing this cat to ward off this Vlad the Impaler. Because it seems that there's some whole backstory where it seems that uh, Vlad the Impaler at some point had killed a cat because it scared him, and then people realized, hey, how about we just send a horde of cats to uh, to to ward off this Vlad. And so we end up having it to where this mercenary grabs this cat and then runs like heck with this knowledge guy to go back to his other two mercenaries. It seems that there is one explosive expert girl named Gary, I think. And so we end up having eventually these mercenaries who are to try and hold off a door while this Vlad is trying to ram through this door. And so we end up deciding to have these mercenaries set up an explosive to go and blow up Vlad with this big batch of C4. We end up having, because they end up kind of naming all the stuff that they have with them, and we have the knowledge guy who's like, dude, that's not enough. But we end up having them blow Vlad the Impaler up with C4. And so we end up having these mercenaries and this knowledge guy running off out of this cave or somewhere close to being out of the location they were in, to then realize that it seems that there was more creatures like Vlad the Impaler on top of this cave. And so we are to assess or assume that every single one of these characters had probably just been killed off, just because we are just to naturally assume that. But again, bizarrely, that's the thing with cats in these episodes. It's weird. And again, a lot of these episodes will be out of order, just so you know. When the yogurt took over, so this is a simple episode. We end up having bizarrely a bizarrish yogurt that was bizarrely, I guess, like manufactured. And so this yogurt all of a sudden starts talking to people, and then eventually this yogurt ends up going to the government and saying, like, well, dude, I figured out how to exactly be able to figure out all of your problems, all your world problems. Like, I can basically create world peace in a instance or whatever. I can basically, like, create the perfect utopia for you as long as you do every single thing that I say. And so we end up having the yogurt going like, we end up having the government talking to this yogurt, and they're like, ha ha ha, ha, you're stupid, you're ridiculous, there's no way you can do this. And so we end up having it to where the yogurt is like, well, okay then, well, I'll just go to China, and like they'll definitely take every word that I say, and everything will be way better off for them. So we end up having the U.S. government deciding to do whatever the yogurt says, but eventually we end up having it to where the government and the earth or whatever, the place that the yogurt is in, ends up deciding to not do exactly word for word what the yogurt says, and then eventually the yogurt is like, dude, like your world is going to crumble because you didn't do exactly what I said. And then the government is like, well, the heck with you. And so we end up having eventually that the yogurt ends up going off into space. And so we end up having it to where it seems that the world ends up like in utter loss because the yogurt like wasn't saving their world, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how that episode bizarrely ends. So we end up having an episode called Beyond the Aquila Rift. So we end up having a character called Thom in this episode, who is to, with his crew, go into this hypersleep because it seems like they are going to go back to a certain location. And so we end up having Thawne and his crew going to sleep, and we end up having them waking up. We end up having them waking up to meet a woman named Greta. And so we end up having Thom meeting Greta, and it seems like they are old friends. It seems like they're catching up. And we end up having it to where Greta mentions to Thom that the course of which that they had selected that they need to have gone to had actually gotten them way off course, and they're seemingly millions upon millions of light years from where they actually are to be able to get back to their home planet. And so we end up having Thom going like, what? So you're basically telling me that I'm basically dead. Like, really, there's no point in me trying to go back home. Because everyone that I know will probably be dead by the time I get back there. Even if I can get back there. And we end up having Greta who's like, well, yeah, but hey, you know what? You do have me. Like, at least you have me here with you. So we end up having Thom eventually sleeping with Greta, doing some space bedroom business, and we eventually have it to where eventually Greta ends up awakening, seemingly one of Thawne's other shipmates. And we end up having this shipmate losing her freaking mind and basically saying that. Pause here for a second. We end up having Thawne's shipmate who ends up saying that this is not Greta. This is not what she thought this was going to be. Ba 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 ba. And so we end up having eventually where Thom is like starting to realize that maybe his crewmate was right. Maybe what he thinks this place is not actually correct. And so we end up having eventually where Thom is kind of questioning everything. Eventually asking Greta, it's like, is what I'm seeing actually real? Like, be honest with me. Is what I'm seeing actually legitimately what I'm seeing? And Greta is like, no. This is not true. This is not real. And so what actually is the real true reality of this situation is something you will not actually want to actually see. And Thom is like, no, like, I'm fine going to be able to actually see what this actually is. Show me. Show me what this actually is. And so we end up having Greta, who ends up granting Thom his wish, and we end up finding out that Thom is actually on some, what I would call some deserted like planet where everybody that he actually knows is all dead, and it seems that he is had this life sucked out of him, like he's been uh like kind of just like been like very scarcely thin, and he's skin and bones, and he ends up going and realizing that it seems that Greta is seemingly actually some spider creature of sorts. And so I guess we end up naturally assuming that Thom, who realizes that he is basically going to waste away and to die here, we end up having eventually Thom going back into his fake reality where he is to live out his days with Greta, realizing that he is basically to die anyways, in this spider inhabited oasis that it seems that every single person ends up there eventually. It seems. So, going on into the next episode, we end up having a episode called Good Hunting, which that episode actually has uh, a man who is, I believe, called Yan, who is to have a father that seems to be gung ho about seemingly killing these women who turn into wolves. And so we end up having Jan's father telling him, like, don't hesitate. Like, make sure you kill every last one of these. And eventually we have Jan, who ends up going to eventually find one of these seemingly uh, younger, like, wolf women. And I believe her name is Tisayo Zhang. I'm just going to call her Zhang from now on. It'll probably be incorrect, but it is what it is. We end up having Yan, who ends up speaking to this Zhang girl, and she ends up asking him, why exactly are you killing my species off? This doesn't make sense. We didn't do anything to you. And so we end up having Yang, who ends up protecting this Zhang girl, and when his father ends up killing the adult version of this woman, Jan's father ends up asking him, like, well, hey, like, do you see any stragglers? And Yang is like, no. So eventually we end up having it to where Yang ends up becoming a much more an adult-like person. It seems like his father ends up dying off. And it seems that eventually we end up having Yang, who ends up bumping into this Jung girl yet again. And it seems that eventually we end up bizarrely, like, here's the thing that didn't quite make sense to me. We end up having Yang, who has this girl turn from a human to a wolf. Then eventually we end up having her eventually being this lady of the night, which she ends up kind of seducing these men. And it seems that that the man that she ends up seducing ends up wanting to turn this girl into a robot. So this guy ends up turning this human wolf girl into a robot, with the exception of her head, and because that's his fantasy of a robot girl. And so we end up bizarrely having this girl who is turned into a robot seeking revenge upon the guy who ended up turning her into this, and she ends up killing him. And so Jung goes to Yan and asks him to be able to uh, fix her, to be able to change her into a much better, uh, I guess, fighting machine. So we end up having Yang, who is very good at, I guess, uh, trains and stuff like that. We end up having Yan eventually figuring out how to fix Jung to eventually go from woman to wolf, and she is now this metal wolf, and she goes out prowling the streets of any man that would try to hurt a woman by stripping down her clothes or whichever. So she ends up attacking them and killing them. Evidently, that's one of the bizarrish episodes that we have within this series. Uh, oh, great. All right. Okay, the next episode. We end up having a episode called The Dump. We end up having a character called, I believe his name is Ugly Dave, who is this junkyard owner, and we have this accountant who makes his way to go to Ugly Dave to say, hey, you know what? You need to sign over your land to me because you know what? Like, it's like you're really behind your dues and everything like that. And we end up having Ugly Dave who tells his accountant, it's like, well, that's fine and great and everything, but how about I spin you a yarn and how about I tell you a story? And then after that, like, you can decide to keep my land or do whatever you want. And so we end up having this accountant forcibly having to listen to this story. So we end up having the Ugly Dave mention that he and one of his friends ended up having seemingly one night of magazine looking and uh, drunken stupidness. And we end up finding out that it seems that Ugly Dave's friend ends up going off to go and take a pee in the junkyard, and he ends up seemingly getting uh, afraid by this one huge monster of a junk heap. And so we end up having Ugly Dave's friend running off to get to Ugly Dave, and it seems that this uh, junkyard monster, which I think his name is Otto, ends up going and having some saliva that can be some kind of spider webbish like thing that clings on to people and ends up sucking them in to be eaten. And so we end up having Ugly Dave, who ends up trying to protect his friend and go after him and try to shoot holes into this Otto character. And so we end up realizing that Ugly Dave is trying to take this thing down with like a God, what is it called? Like a forklift and all kinds of things. And eventually we end up having it to where eventually Ugly Dave realizes that, you know what, like, this thing isn't actually all that bad. I think it's just kind of misunderstood. And we end up finding out that whatever that this thing actually eats, it ends up just becoming one more piece of this junkyard, or this junkyard dog, which is this character named Otto. So we eventually have it to where uh, we end up finding out that this Otto like creature ends up going and is now going to consume this accountant and then eat it. And then we end up having Ugly Dave and Otto just kind of uh, like watching as the consumption of this accountant is happening. And so we end up having Ugly Dave, who ends up like chucking a hand out to Otto for him to go and fetch it, and like it basically becomes a literal metaphor of like a junkyard dog kind of thing, where it's actually actual junkyard made out of a some kind of dog like thing. So kind of fascinating tale. I really enjoyed it. But let's move on. So, shapeshifters. Here's where I kind of say there's a lot of themes that kind of feel familiar. We have it to where it's either a dog, a cat, a wolf, or something. We end up having a military who is trying to do some reconnaissance missions, and we end up finding out that it seems that there are two special men that end up are part of this military force. We end up having this one man who is to go in front of this uh, armored car and this other military officer, and so we end up eventually having this this certain officer. He ends up getting shot in the leg, and so we end up having this guy dropping down, and then he ends up having his eyes seemingly turn into some kind of black or brown. And so we end up having it to where this dog knows exactly where certain people are. It seems like he can sniff them out. It seems that he can be able to see them from far distances and know exactly where they are. So the military people can take them out. It seems that eventually this guy is to eventually heal his wounds fairly quickly. And so we end up finding out that these guys are, because there's two of them, we end up finding out that uh, the main guy's best friend ends up having to leave to go uh, to some other base where they are to, I guess, do some investigating and so on and so forth. And so while these two guys were at this base, we end up having them being shunned by everybody because they don't like the fact that these guys are like dog soldiers and they just don't like them because they're different. But we end up having these dog soldiers who are like, well, you know what? Like, I'm a little like if you keep condescending and shaming us and whatever, like I'm gonna tear your head off and or I'm gonna tear your arm off and beat you with it. So we eventually find that these characters are ridiculously strong and all kinds of things. So we end up having eventually that one of the dog soldiers, like I said, ends up leaving one of the bases. And we eventually end up finding out that it seems that that base is getting overrun and getting shut up and all kinds of things. And so we end up having this one dog soldier that is left running off to get to that other base because it would take the actual military an hour to get to it, but he can get to it in minutes. He ends up making it there to find out that his best friend had been killed in duty, and so we end up finding out that this dog soldier is actually able to turn into a werewolf. And so we end up having this guy who is to realize that it seems that there are other werewolves out there that are actually the enemy. And so we have to have this guy try and track these werewolves down to make amends for him killing his friend and the other base. So we end up having this werewolf guy ending up going out into town trying to sniff, and because he has a scent to these werewolves, he ends up trying to track them down and he can't find them. But eventually, we end up having it to where these werewolves end up making their way to this guy, to this main character guy. Because we end up finding out that there is more than one. There's actually two other enemy werewolves. So we end up having this big fight out. Eventually, the good guy werewolf ends up getting almost losing his arm, and so we end up having this fight out to where eventually that the good werewolf chomps a piece out of one of the enemy werewolf's neck and kills him, and then we also have it to where the good guy werewolf ends up going and consuming the bad guy werewolf's head and then bites down, crushing his skull and killing him. Killing both of these werewolves, we end up having it to where the good guy werewolf makes his way back to his base to basically tell his superior that he's done working with the military and that he goes to pick up his best friend and bury him out in the sand somewhere to tell him to go with nature and that he'll be back with him in some time. And so he ends up leaving off, and that's where we end up leaving off this episode. Kind of interesting. I like this episode because I've always liked a movie like Dog Soldiers or War Soldiers or no, wait, Wolf Soldiers. It's either Wolf Soldiers or it's Dog Soldiers. I think it's Dog Soldiers. Good God. Freaking, I get a call during here and then I freaking get voicemails and all kinds of things. So, the next episode is called an episode called Helping Hand. We end up having a astronaut called Alexandra or Alex, somewhere along those lines. We end up having this astronaut that is to seem to go out onto her spaceship to try and fix something. Something as simple as fixing something. We end up having some kind of piece coming into Earth's atmosphere that ends up going and punching a hole through Alex's spacesuit. Like it ends up crushing her oxygen tank, and it seems that it also has her start to like fly out of outer space because evidently she didn't have a tie or anything onto her ship. So I guess she's just starting to float off into space. We end up having it to where Alex makes a call to her other astronauts to just say, hey man, like, I just got hit by something and my suit is malfunctioning. And so we end up having Alex, who is to get a call that says, well, okay, like, somebody's going to help you out in like an hour from now. And she's like, dude, I only have like 14 minutes. Like, I'm not going to make it in that amount of time. Like, it's impossible. And so we end up having it to where Alex now has to do a desperate measure like move. And so she ends up deciding to try to create some kind of thing to where she can push off of in space. So she ends up going and latching her arm to take off her one glove, or her one arm glove like thing. And so we end up having Alex, who ends up tossing this glove to create a kind of way of her to like push back off of, for her to be able to get back to her ship, but she can't cling on to anything, and she ends up just floating right back off to space. So we end up having Alex, who ends up now having to have a completely frozen blue-looking arm. And so we end up having Alex who's like, well, take two. So we end up having Alex who ends up having to break off her own arm, her own hand, to now throw that into space, to where we end up having Alex who's desperately trying to touch onto her spacecraft. And so we end up having that scene cut there, where we are to see that Alex had made it safely back to her ship, and now there is the guys that were going to call her and get an update on her situation and ask like, hey buddy, do you need a hand? And she's like, well, surefire enough, yeah, I did lose my hand in this whole like thing. You would have thought that she would have had some like tethering thing to her in her ship, because you would have thought that that would have been a thing that she would have done, but I guess not. I guess they didn't think of that when they were writing the story, that most astronauts would have themselves tethered to the spacecraft that they were on and whatever what have you, but I guess not. So with that said, yeah, let's move on to the next episode. So we have a episode called Fish Night, where we end up having two salesmen that are door-to-door salesmen that are to be driving along and their car completely runs out of gas. And so we end up having one veteran salesman who is to mention about how easy things used to be, and like times aren't what they used to be. And we have this much younger salesman that is just kind of impulsive and like is just uh, kind of the younger guy out of this bunch, of course, because it feels obvious that way. So we have these two salesmen who decide to, like, well, I guess I'm just gonna sleep in the car and we'll just see what ends up happening if somebody ends up driving by or whatever. And so we end up having a bizarre alien aquatic like thing to go on within uh this location that they're at. Bizarrely, we end up having this neon like uh fish experiment going on, where it seems that we end up seeing these neon fish just kind of floating in the air, and all of this bizarreness, to where we end up having these two salesmen going out to see all this aquatic life that seems to be just all around this environment. It seems like the fish are kind of very alienistic. It doesn't look like the normal fish that you would have normally seen. But anyways, we end up having it to where the younger of the two salesmen decide, well, hey, like these things are swimming. Like, hey, how about I just be able to swim as well? How about I just be able to do exactly what they're doing? And we end up having the older salesman. It's like, dude, like, get your head on straight. But we have this younger salesman who takes off all of his clothes and ends up deciding to go and just swim with all these fish. And he's just swimming and swimming to eventually see that there is, the older salesman sees that there is a shark coming on the horizon that ends up actually going and consuming this younger salesman. And surefire enough, the younger salesman dies, and so the veteran salesman is just looking on as his other salesman was to die. And so, really, it's just like, well, that's just the end of that story. That's the end of that chapter. So, moving on. So, we have this episode called Lucky 13. We end up having this military girl, I think her name is Cutter, and she is to find this jet that she ends up getting stuck with that seems to be the most unluckiest number. It seems that she has this jet called 13. It seems that the jet has 13 on it, and eventually also the numbers that are all collected together on this ship are all to be a combination of the number 13. And so we end up having Cutter, who ends up going onto this ship, and we end up finding out that it seems that when she ends up going on missions, seems that we end up finding out that she ends up going and being able to rescue uh, every single soldier that she needs to, where all the other pilots end up crashing and burning and dying and getting killed. So we end up having Cutter, who ends up consistently going on to this plane, and every single mission ends up being successful because Lucky 13. To the point of Cutter ending up loving the jet that she is on, and we end up having her superiors saying how wonderful that she's doing, to the point where eventually uh, they're even asking her, it's like, well, hey, like, do you want to give up this bucket of bolts for an upgraded model? And Cutter's like, no, like, I love this ship, or I love this plane. So we end up having Cutter eventually getting to the point of her consistently doing mission after mission after mission. There's a whole montage of it that she is very successful with this. And so we end up eventually having Cutter, who ends up going on one last mission where eventually we end up having it to where finally the plane ends up getting hit and ends up crashing. And so we end up having it to where the cutter is to forcibly have to detonate this jet to have it explode, to where the enemy ends up going on near the plane, and the jet does not want to explode. But Cutter is like, well, hey, like, ship, like, you need to explode because we need to get out of here. So eventually the plane does explode because it seems like this jet bizarrely has some kind of personality or something. And so it's kind of like the movie Stealth, bizarrely. So we end up having this plane explode, and that ends up helping Cutter and all of her people ending up getting out of there and succeeding and being able to get out of there. But she ended up on some other jet, but she would have traded her soul to be able to be back within uh, that plane 13 because that was the most successful plane that she was in. So moving on. So we have Zemo Blue, which is actually the last episode of this show, but jumbled order, I guess. So Zemo Blue is an episode about a artist that seems to have this infinity like love for this color blue. And so we end up having this news reporter called Claire going out to interview this Zemo Blue character. And so it seems that this Zemo Blue character we end up finding out is some artist of sorts. And he ended up going and like painting some paintings at first and ended up trying to put in this blue every single time he ended up painting, but then he ended up looking out onto space and then realized like, well, I should really do these like space paintings. And so he ended up doing these space paintings, but then bizarrely like kept adding in these little like blue boxes or blue circles or blue squares or blue whatever. And so we eventually have it to where Zima realizes that that's not good enough. That he ended up having to like build a light blue skyscraper to the heavens to where everyone can see it. And then eventually, like it gets to the point of that not being good enough that he wants to go and paint the outer space, like paint the outer space blue, like paint like half of the moon blue or something. And so that's not good enough. And so we end up having it to where eventually Zima Blue is to go and make this big, gigantic pool that is reminiscent to the very first time that he'd ever seen this blue. And so we end up having Zima, who is now so rich that he is not a human anymore. He's just a cyborg-like thing. And so we end up having Zima diving into this pool, and he ends up taking himself apart one by one to eventually have uh, this robot just be a cleaning piece for this pool. So he ends up dying in the very last thing that he ends up remembering about the reason why he ended up wanting to do this blue thing all along. Very bizarre like episode. Like to me, I was like, this episode sucks out of probably most of these, but it is what it is. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of artsy, and for people that like that kind of thing, this will be your episode. So we have an episode called Blind Spot where we end up having some mercenaries trying to get to this one truck-looking thing that looks it's like a truck train kind of thing where there's several compartments, and so we end up having these mercenaries. I think one is named Hawk, one girl is named Callie, one character is named Sui, and one character is named Rookie. So we end up having all of these guys who are driving around this trucker like thing with this other guy feeding them information. we end up having them putting bombs onto the side of this truck-like thing, and we eventually accidentally have, I think, Sui ending up detonating one of the bombs early because Callie naturally had said that these guys aren't to be trusted with bombs, and so we end up having Sui who ends up detonating one of the bombs early, and that ends up creating all craziness to where all of a sudden this trucker thing has starting to put out defenses, and so now we end up having it to where Sui ends up jumping onto this truck thing to try to defend off all of these guys, and so we end up one by one start to have all of these characters one by one starting to jump onto this trucker, but this truck thing, and so we end up having it to eventually Sui's to make it on there. Then the rookie is to try to make it on there, and they all succeed. And so we end up having Hawk, who ends up having to jump onto this truck as well to try to take out some of the gun parts of this truck that was like shooting all of these bullets and stuff like that, and Sui couldn't like defend himself because he only has one arm. So we have Hawk who ends up easily taking down all these gun things that end up popping up, and so we end up having Hawk who's just like, yeah, like, hey man, we took care of that, and then we end up having immediately some big huge robot like thing that ends up appearing behind Hawk that ends up going and crushing Hawk's head, and so now we end up having it to where it's a race against time for both either Sui or the rookie to try and take down this robot's defense system, which eventually, I guess, will kill this thing. And so we end up having eventually Sui and the rookie figuring out how to get this robot thing to fall off the truck, which this robot just turns into a vehicle of sorts and ends up just running over Callie and killing her, to where eventually we end up having this robot making its way back onto the truck, to where it ends up trying to take down Sui and the rookie. So we end up having it to where we have Sui who is to basically be having his head crushed by this robot, but eventually we end up having him defeating this robot anyways and detonating some explosion to make this robot just detonate and explode and whatever. And so we end up having it to where the rookie is the only one that is really and truly left. And so we end up having the rookie who ends up fishing out some chip or some piece from this robot, which ends up being the thing that I guess that they needed. And so we end up finding out that the rookie's like info man, I guess, had been following shortly behind them, and so this info guy ended up retrieving the rookie, and we also end up finding out that every single one of these Hawk, Sui, Callie are actually people that eventually, I guess, could get cloned or could get rebuilt. So recently, the rookie is thinking that these guys are just dead, when in all actuality they can just be remade or rebuilt or whatever. And so not a real true loss there. So moving on to the next episode, which is called Ice Age, we end up having both Rob and Gail, who is to, I guess, have bought a apartment of sorts or a home of sorts, and we end up having them open up their ice box to realize that it seems like in their freezer there seems to be some kind of civilization that is living inside of their freezer. We end up having both Rob and Gail looking on as seemingly this world is being built in front of them within their icebox. We end up having seemingly entire historical events kind of happening, or like kind of eras in this town happening, where it's like the Renaissance uh, and like certain eras of time and whatever, like the Greek ages and all kinds of things, and all kinds of whatever historical kind of eras, caveman, so on, so forth. And so we end up eventually going into almost modern time within a short period of time. So then eventually there ends up being some kind of nuclear war that ends up happening, that ends up actually hitting Rob in the face with this explosion, and ends up kind of burning his face. We end up eventually having it to where they're thinking it's like, oh, well, maybe like everybody is all gone, but then eventually they end up like rebuilding, and eventually coming to almost a futuristic era. So futuristic that eventually they end up just turning into a ball of light and just kind of fizzing out everywhere, and then completely and utterly vanish. And to where they're like, oh, well, are they gone? Like, are they going to come back? And so we end up having both Rob and Gail going and opening back up their freezer one day to realize that this whole freezer had started civilization all over again, to where it's now back to a dinosaurish like era, and to where it's going to start all over again. So we have this like endless loop of a civilization who's going through every single time era that is just going to just be a non-stopping thing. So with that said, we end up having a episode called Alternate History. So these kind of episodes are kind of one and the same almost, to where we end up taking one thing of history where we are trying to define what would to happen if Adolf Hitler was killed a certain specific way. It seems that in one part we end up having Hitler who is killed by a little girl that ends up starting some World War thing, and then ends up in a horrific like attempt. We end up having at some point Hitler being killed by some Jello mold, and we end up finding out that it seems like all war has basically stopped because there had been some Jello mold weapon that would wipe out everyone, and so on and so forth. We eventually at some point have like Hitler being killed, I think, by some rat or something, to where we end up finding out that the rats had like taken over the world, and so on and so forth. Like all kinds of bizarre like things going on with this character. We end up eventually having it to where Hitler is killed by a bunch of overcrazed bedroom business women, where we end up finding out that these women are from some uh, outer space planet that seduces people, and like that goes the way that goes, and eventually we end up like it's always at the end of it that we end up finding out that some person from somewhere ends up landing upon the moon and is the first one, because this adjusts every single time to go into these wild cockamamie like stories of how the world changes and how the world ends, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so with that said, like that's that episode where I thought was really fun, really bizarre. Like it was kind of fun to like run through all these scenarios, because I remember some of them like like this is really fun. So this is the last episode called The Secret War, which isn't actually the last episode of this, but you get what I'm saying. The Secret War. So we seemingly have a Russian army that is to go and eventually scout out to find some demonic like beings going and trying to kill off all of their lands. And so they have to scout this thing out and try to wipe it out. So we end up finding that this Russian army is eventually seemingly going to try and take these things down, and sometimes be successful at it, sometimes not. Eventually, we end up finding them eventually getting outnumbered, and they otherwise decide that, like, well, hey, like, we're gonna go and send one guy out to get some planes to come down here and wipe all these monsters out. And so while that guy is doing that, we're just gonna create a lasting defense. And so we end up having these Russian soldiers who end up doing this last stand like thing to where they end up trying to take out as many of these things as they can. And some of the soldiers actually take their own lives. Some of them try to go out in a blaze of glory, but pretty much a lot of them end up going out. Some of them end up trying to use explosions to try to defend themselves, and so on and so forth. But eventually, all of them eventually do die. To eventually have a bunch of planes all coming to this location to wipe all these monsters out. It seems that the Russians had some military force who ended up deciding to go and seek other different ways of a demonic creatures to think that someone could control these demonic creatures and be able to uh, use them to their advantage as to have them to use as a war device. But it seems that these creatures who this guy thought he could control, actually instead they ended up just killing this guy and then just running amok onto the planet just because, like, well, like, dude, you thought that you could control the demons? It doesn't work that way. But these people were surefire thinking that they could control these demons and that would work out, but it didn't. They ended up just getting consumed, and so that's what basically ended up with a bunch of these military soldiers who ended up trying to make a last defense. Once these people ended up finding out this backstory, we ended up having some of these military soldiers like, well, why can't we just like go and tell this to somebody? To like to make that story be told, and it's like no one would ever believe them, or just really this and that and whatever have you. It just would never come to pass. So that is it for all of these episodes. Thank God, because I was thinking that I was going to have a huge amount of problems figuring or remembering all this stuff. And luckily, I also remembered some of the names this time around because I think before I didn't remember anything. I think I just kind of was trying to go through this as quickly as humanly possible before, and kind of really rush through a lot of stuff. Where this time around, at least I got some of the names and stuff like that. There was some stuff that was probably mixed around or whatever because I didn't clearly know every single name of every person. But with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.